Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Welcome to another episode of She is Resilient. Today we have another amazing guest, Noura. Noura, do you want to tell us who you are and what you do for a living?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited. My name is Noura Bermudez, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. And I own Bermudez Therapy Services, which provides therapy for women around Rancho Cucamonga and all throughout California. I started my business about 5 years ago, right after I had my daughter. So I had Bermuda's Therapy Services, and then I started my private practice about a year ago. So I went off on my own doing that. Yeah, and I just love what I do. I love helping people. I love seeing the magic in people healing and growing. Personally have experienced it, and I know the power just the power of it in people's lives, and I've experienced it with my clients or just like people in my everyday life, and it's just a great passion of mine to like help people be there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you're someone that can help others. So tell us a little bit about your healing journey and maybe a little bit about what helped you get to this current version of you.
Okay, that's I'll make it a shorter version of what I wanted to share. Well, just to give a little bit of background history. So I grew up in a very like stressful environment. There was domestic violence. I was aware of it growing up, and there was a lot of stress and just the arguing and fighting, and also on top of that, I grew up in a really religious home. So my dad's Muslim, and it was, in my eyes, extremely just like strict household, very religious, very limited on what we were allowed to do and what we were not allowed to do. So a lot of rigidity. And so growing up, at least in my experience, I've learned to become that way. And so having like very rigid and very inflexible ways of like thinking and behaving and just living life, and not even realizing that I was doing that until adulthood, right? And so as I got older and started wanting to work on myself, seeing how my past of being around violence, being around so much anger, being around so much rigidity, and just like all these things, and even just witnessing, how people treat each other when they love each other, or are married, just
Mhm.
learning so much from my parents and the environment that I grew up in. I knew like this doesn't feel right. This isn't, how I want my life to be,
Mhm.
And I think from a very young age, I don't know why, from a very young age, I knew that it felt wrong and that it
Mhm.
was weird, even though I never talked about it with like friends.
Mhm.
But I knew like, I don't think other people are living like this, I don't
Yeah.
think like other people have my experience. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. There was something in your body that was saying, "This doesn't feel good, and there must be something wrong." Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And so then, from a very young age, I was a very anxious kid.
Mhm.
And I became an overachiever. I was a very
Mhm.
much a perfectionist. I got really good grades. I'm the oldest, so we know about the oldest. They usually are the one that's the most responsible and takes care of their younger siblings. And so, yeah, I took on that role. And it was really reinforced, right? Like through childhood into my adolescence and even adulthood, it was like, wow, look at you. Like you're on top of it. You get everything done. You're the good kid,
Mhm.
and obviously I'm going to keep doing it if it's being reinforced, right? If I
Uh-huh,
don't know,
uh-huh. Yeah.
and so after my parents had separated, I was 13, and my mom really went on this like healing journey
Mhm.
of like going to her own therapy and
Mhm.
really going back to college and getting her own job and just like growing.
Mhm.
And I really was like fascinated with like she started taking classes in psychology at the
Mhm.
community college by our house. And I was just so fascinated. I started getting into psychology
Mhm.
and just seeing how different my life started to change after my parents had separated and how I started to have like the freedom
Yeah.
of being who I wanted to be and live. I mean, I was still a kid, right? I was 13, but still there was just so much more freedom
Mhm.
of, okay, who do I want to be? How do I want to think? How do I want to, live my life? And I've been wanting to like really understand humans and how they think and behave and why they
Mhm.
do the things they do. So yeah,
Mhm.
so then I just started to really take classes in college, even in high school of like psychology. And with that, I started really, really like wanting like this strong urge within me wanting to like heal myself without even really being aware that I
Totally.
wanted to do that. Yes. And I think for a long time I felt like something was wrong with me.
Mhm.
And I felt like I don't know if I could cuss, but I felt like I was
Yeah.
effed up.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
You can cuss in here. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I felt like, something is wrong with me. Like I'm just like always in my head. I'm so anxious and just like, I just felt like I would describe it to people like I felt like there was like scrambled eggs in my brain, like felt like
Mm.
scrambled eggs, and I was like, you know what? Like, I don't want to repeat what I saw growing up. And so then, I went to school to become a therapist. I started to get therapy myself,
Yeah.
um, at a pretty young age.
Mhm.
Um, and it just like my mind was blown with just like all this insight.
Mhm. Yeah, so maybe tell us a little bit about what those healing methods were, and then tell us what you noticed inside. What was shifting inside that told you that you were healing?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. So, you know what? The things that I was doing, like I mentioned, was therapy, but I started to like do things that I enjoyed and that just felt good because I
Mhm.
think, right, I was not really allowed to do that at a
Mhm.
young age. It was like a lot of things were wrong. And so like just giving myself that permission to do things that I enjoyed just because I wanted to, not because there was like it had to be done,
Mhm.
and so I also, I became really active. I love exercising.
Mhm.
But I think the biggest change was I remember reading a woman's health magazine,
Mhm.
and there was like this like elderly woman doing a yoga pose, and I was
Mhm.
like, whoa. And so I started watching YouTube videos at home of
Mhm.
yoga with Adriene.
Shout out to
I
Adrian.
remember, yeah. And I remember doing it one time and like crying. And I
Mhm.
was like, what the heck? Why am I crying? I'm like crying during yoga. And it's just like, but it's like this happy cry, this
Mhm.
like release. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, I think something's happening. Something wonderful is happening here.
Mhm.
And so that's where I really got deep into like meditation, mindfulness, yoga. And it was so incredibly healing for me because I feel like I was able to shut everything out
Mhm.
and just tune into myself, which
Yeah.
I have not. I think that was like the first time I ever was able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. You were saying that your mind was like scrambled eggs. It sounds like
Hmm.
something shifted for you there, right? Where things maybe
Hmm.
didn't start to feel like that inside.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I'm curious to know what were some of the other things, even like behaviorally, right? Or emotionally, that you were like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's interesting. I never would have done this before, but now I am.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I was like, it was weird because not only mentally did I slow down, but even physically, I would
Yeah.
slow down. Like, even the way I walked would be slower, right? Like that sense of urgency. I mean, it's still there, it still
Yeah.
comes up, right? But like, it would, it would really just like quiet that voice of like, okay, come on, let's go, let's go, let's go.
Hmm.
So I noticed that, right? And I also noticed that like I was feeling less anxious and less, I think the dominant emotion that I was feeling a lot in childhood and growing up is just
Mm.
so much anger and resentment towards my parents, toward just like anger of like how I grew up and why
Hmm.
did I have to grow up this way? Why did I end up this way? Right? Like all of that.
Hmm.
And letting that anger, not necessarily pushing it away, right? But like nurturing that anger and like allowing space for me to forgive, and not for that person, but like for myself, for my peace of
Yeah.
mind of like practicing compassion, kindness, forgiveness. I was like, wow, I'm able to tap into that where I never thought that I would have been able to do that because it was
Yeah.
such a big part of my life.
Totally. And were you doing that through meditation or were you doing that
Hmm.
through other ways?
Yeah, meditation is just like a puzzle piece for
Yeah.
me. Like it's a big puzzle piece, right? But it is like I find a lot of healing through journaling. I do a lot of journaling,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of like inner child work through my journaling and through my meditation,
Yeah,
which brings so many tears, but they're like healing tears.
totally. Yeah.
um yeah, and you know what, I've found that like again, just doing things that I enjoy is also healing. Like I love gardening,
Mm.
and buying plants and just like gardening and taking care of them, and it's like it's so healing, and being in nature and going to just gardens, that
Mm-hmm.
is so healing for me. Recently I picked up rollerblading. I just started
Ooh, I love
rollerblading.
that. I love that.
Yeah, and I think I'm wanting to tap into that child part of me.
Hmm.
And so it like when I put them on for the first time, I felt like the emotions, and I was like, okay, this is a healing part for me. Like I'm like letting myself like play.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, doing stuff like that, like just having fun, just have fun and be silly and like, oh, it's so like, it feels so good to do that.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel like that's such a significant piece of healing, right? I think that so
Hmm.
often when we start our healing journeys, we think that we have to only focus on the negative things or the uncomfortable things, and we have to be uncomfortable. But that's a
Hmm.
myth, right?
Yeah.
Healing really happens when we honor ourselves by playing, by laughing, by doing things that maybe we didn't have an opportunity to do before, right? By
Hmm.
gardening, spending time in nature, and really focusing on those things that make us feel good. That's where
Hmm.
resiliency starts to build, right? From what
Yeah.
feels good, not from like what doesn't feel good, because then we wire ourselves to stay in that.
Yeah. And I like that you bring that up because I completely agree. I
Yeah.
went through a phase where I was like, I have to meditate every day and I have to journal and I have to like, it was such a like rigid way of like trying to work on my healing. And I realized like, oh my God, I'm living my life to try to heal. And I'm like, no, like I need to live my life.
Yes.
And so and I think having a daughter helped me. I
Mhm.
mean, I have a 5-year-old daughter, so like I have to play with her and like do kid stuff anyways. And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I might as well. A lot of it is not that fun, but some of it is. And I'm like, and she has rollerblades. And I'm like, I'm gonna rollerblade with her. Like, that's fun, you know? And so
Wow.
like allowing myself to be like, I don't really feel like doing this today. Like if I don't want to meditate, okay, like that's going to be hard on me because I do have this routine of like how I like to do things. But I know that instead maybe I just want to read a book or lay on the
Mhm.
couch or go outside or whatever.
Mhm.
And that can also be just as healing for me.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's just listening to what the body really needs. Maybe some days
Yeah.
it's laughter and play, and the other days it's just rest and doing absolutely nothing, watching Netflix all
Mhm.
day if you need to.
Exactly, exactly. And that could be, I think, really hard for a lot of people, especially
Yeah.
people that feel a lot of anxiety,
Yeah.
and are like the go, go, go of like
Mhm.
rest can
Yeah,
be so good for you.
totally.
And yeah, and I think I always used to think like, oh my God, I have to be moving my body, I have to be exercising, I have to get stronger.
Mm.
And even with yoga, I would like really pretzel myself into these poses and then I would hurt myself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'd be like, wow, I need to really pull back and just
Mhm.
listen to my body. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I started doing yoga, that's when I first started to realize that I was a perfectionist, and I was like, "Oh, I'm really
Mm.
trying to, like, perfect these poses."
Yeah.
And for
Yes.
you, yoga allowed you to release some of that energy that was stored in your body.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And they say too, when you practice yoga, it's like what you practice on the mat is you practice that in real life too, right? And so you want it to
totally.
transfer over. So yeah, so seeing myself like really push my body and force, and instead of just like allowing it
Mhm.
to do what it wants to naturally and listening to it. So I think that's a big thing that
Yeah.
I've learned within the last few years is like really listening to myself and like
Mhm.
honoring what I want and what I need. Because I was so used to being told what to do or like worried about like, oh, if I do this, is it going to upset this person?
Mhm.
And really like unlearning that
Yeah.
and saying, well, what do I want and how can I listen to that and how can I be nice to that part of myself, you know?
Totally. So, for people who resonate with what you're saying, what would you suggest they do if they're feeling like they want to honor their bodies, but they just don't know how to do that, or they want to rest, but they just don't know how to rest? They feel like they're always on the go. What would you
Hmm.
suggest they do? How can you start honoring your body?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that like rest is necessary, like they think like it's just laying on the couch and doing nothing,
Mhm.
right? But rest could mean so many things, right? Rest
Mhm.
could mean you're not going to pick up that phone call, right? If
Yeah.
you're mentally not in that headspace, right?
Yeah.
And so I think everybody in some ways they do honor their bodies in some ways, maybe not all the time, but
Mhm.
really finding that time that they do, right? And saying, okay, let's stick to that, right? Like you just did that, you just listened to your body,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And let's really hold on to that and like see what helped you do that, right? Like if you think
Yeah.
about too, like say someone they tripped and they sprained their ankle, right? And they're nurturing that, they're off their feet. That's a way of honoring what your body needs, right?
Mhm.
There may not be that connection of like I'm connecting with my body and I'm honoring it. They may
Mhm.
just think I'm just following doctor's orders and I can't wait until I could get back on my feet, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And yeah,
I love
and
that.
so yeah,
It
right.
right, it's about noticing those tiny moments, right? And it kind of connects
Mhm.
back to what we were saying about, like, playing and laughing and noticing the pleasant sensations and what feels good inside, right? So you're kind of
Mhm.
doing the same thing in trying to identify when are those moments that you have honored your body.
Yes, exactly, exactly. I see it a lot too with like music, right? Of
Mhm.
like my clients listening to music
Mhm.
and it's soothing the body,
Yeah.
right? And so it's things like this where it's like they are practicing it, maybe not all day every day, right? and maybe not as much as they need, but
Mhm.
people are doing things that feel good to
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
Right. And some of the things that feel good may not be actually good for them, but
Yeah.
there are things that they're doing that feel good that are actually good for them. And then we pick that and we say, wow, look at that. You're able to do it. Right. You're
Yes.
able to do it. And then there's that where you can cultivate that like sense of agency and
Yes.
empowerment, right? Of like, oh, wow,
Totally.
I have been doing that. I didn't even know that. Okay. Now we've already done the hardest part, right? Of like finding something, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, cool.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I'm wondering, what are some of the things that people can do on a daily basis? Some practical tools that they could practice to create that sense of agency or that resiliency in their nervous systems.
That's such a good question. One of my favorite things that I like to tell my clients is to try to keep a promise to themselves once a day.
Oh,
And
I
to
love
like,
that.
I really like that one. I don't know why, but I let them pick any promise. And it could be like, drink a glass of water a day, right? Like it could
Mhm.
be something which may be really hard for somebody, right? It could be go outside. And so I have them do that, and then we also talk about what happens when you break that promise, right? Because that's just as important of how do you respond to yourself? How
Mhm.
do you treat yourself when you break that promise? And so being able to build that trust within yourself of like, wow, I'm able to keep promises to myself, but I'm also able to really love myself and show up for myself even when I break my own promise.
Yeah,
And so I think that really helps people kind of create that sense of agency of like, I do have control over myself
yeah,
and my body and what I do and what I don't do. And even if I fall back and forget or don't feel motivated, like I can still be nice to
yeah.
myself and I can still love myself.
Yeah, that's a hard one. So how
Yeah.
how can people be kind to themselves when they don't keep that promise to themselves? Because that's it's easier said than done, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. I think it's yeah. And so you know what I always like to encourage them is like think about like if you were to talk to like a child, right? Or
Mhm.
like you as a child. If you would say that to that person, then okay,
Mhm.
say that to yourself. But
Mhm.
if what you're going to say may really hurt that kid and like cause them to cry, that's probably something you shouldn't say to yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's not necessarily about like actually saying something loving right away because they may not have the language yet to say that, right?
Mhm.
But it could be, well, maybe try not to say those things,
Yeah.
right? Instead of
Yeah.
I hate my body or I'm so dumb that I didn't go and work out today. I'm so lazy. I can't get anything done. Right? Okay, like maybe that's not what you need to say and finding maybe some space to reframe and saying I'm disappointed that I didn't go to the gym,
Yeah.
right? I'm really having a hard time right now. And I feel like I want to beat myself up
Mhm.
because I didn't do this today. See,
Yeah.
you can still acknowledge it,
Yeah.
right?
Totally.
It's just how you say it,
Exactly. Yeah,
right?
that makes a lot of sense, and it reminds me of, when you're young and you learn, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like that. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all to
Yeah.
yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And even if you do say it,
Mhm.
catch yourself and say, oh my goodness, I'm noticing I'm being really mean to myself. And just
Yeah.
having that awareness, right? Of like, by you acknowledging what you're
Mhm.
doing, I think
Mhm.
that in itself is being mindful and that's being loving because you're now validating and acknowledging what's going on with you.
Yes,
Right. And saying,
exactly.
oh, you know what? I'm falling into those patterns and I'm having a really hard time. And I know I'm being critical
Mhm.
and that's okay. You're just noticing. You're just
Exactly.
noticing. Saying these nice and loving things,
Yeah.
that is more of like that comes down the right down the line. That takes a while, right?
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Saying the nice things about yourself is going to come
Mhm.
naturally once you start to practice some of the other tools, right? Or once you start
Exactly.
to be more intentional or practice being a little bit more mindful.
Exactly. Yeah. And not everybody responds well to the thinking part of things, right? And it may just be, okay, well, how can I just connect with my body and be like more compassionate and loving with my body? And, some people, it's really hard for them to like just give themselves a hug,
Yeah.
And so like practicing things like that, where it's like, okay, maybe you're just like massaging your hands or like you're rubbing your arm, some act of like compassion and
Yeah.
kindness.
Yeah.
That way you can really just start to kind of cultivate that within of like, okay,
Yeah.
I may not have the words or I may not have the thinking pattern to do that, but I can maybe just like rock myself, or I can hum, or I can go on a walk, and that's like something I'm doing for my body and connecting with my body. So it could be,
1000%.
combination of things.
Yes, I love that. I love everything that you just mentioned, and especially the rocking and the swaying, right? Because especially for complex trauma survivors, right? Like they may not have had that as babies or as infants, right? They maybe didn't get to be nurtured in that way. And then when you get to do that for yourself, it can be so powerful.
It can, right? And
Yeah.
it could be even powerful if they can't do it, right? Because then you're like,
Yeah.
oh, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, this is difficult for you,
Yeah.
And sometimes when something is really difficult for us to do, it could be what we need the most
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
of. And so, yeah, I think everybody's different and everybody has their own wants and their needs and how to meet them. And I think it's all about experimenting
Mm-hmm.
and just realizing that the mind and the body are interconnected, and that like you can't focus on one without the other,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and working with what your strengths are and what you have and building from that.
Yeah, totally, totally. I love that. Thank you so much for your wisdom. I like want to like do some snaps because it was so
Yeah.
good. It was so good.
Thank
So,
you.
how can people connect with you and what do you have going on? If people want to work with you or just connect with you, how can they do that?
Yeah. So right now I'm just accepting new clients. I work with women.
Mhm,
Again, in California, I offer only virtual therapy.
mhm.
My specialties include, who I really do my best work with is anxious women. I'm very familiar with that, right? Okay. So I like to work with really anxious women, overachievers, perfectionists, women that can't slow down. I really love working with that population. I also really like to work with women in relationships who really struggle with like their attachment with their partner. So, there's a lot of fear of abandonment, fear that the partner doesn't love them. There may be some jealousy. So there's a lot of attachment wounds that I like to work on.
Mhm,
And finally, I like to also really like to work with women who've been disowned by their parents.
mm,
So yeah,
mhm,
so I really like to work on that, especially women that are Middle Eastern,
mhm,
and they're maybe trying to, date outside their culture or start living their life, very different from their family, and they're probably not getting the support that they are
mhm,
hoping from their family.
mhm,
So
mhm,
that's the type of people I really do my best work with, and I love, love, love. And so people can find me. They can contact me on my website at bermudeztherapy.com.
mhm.
I'm also on Instagram, although I don't post that much, but I am on there. So it's at Bermudez Therapy.
Amazing, wonderful. Well, if you're in California and you resonated with Nora, then you can contact her and hire her as your therapist.
Thank you so much.
Alrighty. It was great having you and seeing you and talking to you.
Yes, you too. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.